coffee, tea, and rum. One day the tonguing is done, take our leave and go. At a fair in the sun of the town, her hair was blonde and this was around. She made a whaler man come around. Since building my skiff in the fall of 2021, I've dreamed of going on a multi-day journey, sailing point to point, ideally downwind. I had passed up several opportunities to take that trip, but finally, in late May of 2023, conditions were looking very favorable, and I decided to go for it. I would be sailing the 15-foot solid wood skiff that I had built myself. She's lug-rigged and sports a small mizzen. Many modern sailors would consider her badly under-canvassed, but this boat is really more oriented towards voyaging and getting from A to B. She has no motor, and the only auxiliary power is a pair of oars and brute exertion. Our journey would take place over the course of 3 days on the waters of Lake Barkley, formed by the Cumberland River, and I would camp 2 nights on the shores of Land Between the Lakes. I planned to set out from Crooked Creek near the 6880 bridge and make my way to the north as far as I could down the length of Lake Barkley. If I was very fortunate, the wind would hold its easterly and southeasterly direction for the next few days as predicted, but that's asking a lot of Mother Nature, and I knew there was no guarantee of that. My only real goal was to travel as far as possible in the 3 days allotted. I had several takeout points planned depending on how many miles I was able to cover. There was a short takeout, a middle takeout, and an extended takeout that I really had no plan of making, but the farthest possible point was the canal where Lake Barkley and Kentucky Lakes meet. I was traveling point to point, and I was to be picked up by my dad on the 3rd day. According to my charts, the farthest possible distance I could cover would be just short of 30 miles, and I was expecting to maybe do half that if I was lucky. I really didn't know. I arrived at the Crooked Creek launch site greeted by an easterly wind as expected. This easterly would make it a little bit difficult tacking my way out of the creek, but it would actually be ideal once I get out to open water. With the boat fully rigged and all the camping gear and provisions loaded, I raised the main just to do some final checks and ensure that all the sailing gear is in order. This was to be a very tight launch with a dock and a small dam to leeward, and I wouldn't have much margin for error. Sydney had called to wish me well, and just as we were hanging up, I heard someone yelling out in pain, and I looked around the parking lot, and I didn't really see where it was coming from at first, and no one else seemed to notice. Then I realized just adjacent from my boat was another boat still on the trailer, and there was a guy laying down on the ground, face down. He had blood dripping down his face. He had tripped over the tongue of his trailer, fallen flat on his face, on his nose, and he had a really bad nosebleed. I got into my first aid kit and I just gave him a big wad of gauze, and he stuffed that up his nose, and it did eventually stop the bleeding. But then once we had got his face cleaned up, I realized there was a pretty deep cut on his cheek. It was an older guy, and apparently he was taking prescription blood thinners, and so that's why he was bleeding so bad, but he was more or less all right. But an incident like that could have been a lot worse, especially for an older person, if that had happened somewhere more remote when no one was around. I haven't had one to get away yet, but that wouldn't be good if it did.
No, it wasn't. My son back several years ago, he was supposed to help the boat when it come off the tractor.
Oh, yeah?
Turn it loose, it was way out there.
Yeah.
We had to wait for hours for somebody to come around through there in the boat and He's saying, I guess he thought somebody fell out there, and now here I was just waiting.
Yeah. As I got underway, I realized that the mizzen sheet was fouled up, but I knew better than to try to fix it before I had gotten safely away from the dock and the dam. Sailing with the mizzen trimmed kind of funky, I still managed with some concentration to get out to better water, and then I got that line cleared up. It took me about 45 minutes to tack my way into the east wind out to the mouth of the creek, and there I stopped and anchored out for a little bit of lunch. Being anchored in the lee of the point, I decided it would be most efficient to row my way out to open water. Once I had rowed out far enough, I should be able to set the sails and begin the long downwind voyage. These trees seemingly growing out of the middle of the lake indicate a very common type of hazard on these waters. Outside of the marked channels, Barkley can be very treacherous with many bars and concealed hazards, even concealed man-made obstacles such as sunken bridges and even houses. Most of my route would be outside the marked channels. My reasoning was I would rather take my chances with a grounding than with some of the reckless, fast-moving powerboaters that I would be likely to run into on the main river channel and creek channels. The reality of utilizing a small, non-powered craft on these waters is that people just are not looking for you. Even flying full sail, it's just a huge risk, especially when you see some of the displacement cruisers out here, some of the big monsters. I have to wonder what the skipper can see at all. It seems like they can't see much of anything very near them. Under many conditions, a white sail simply blends in with the sky or the water. Just as I pass the mouth of the creek and get out to the point where I'm about ready to set sail, the wind dies off almost completely. The wind is still calm, but I decide to get some canvas in the air and wait. starboard, you'll notice a large transfer tower emerging from the middle of the lake. This is a crossing of transfer wires, and I can't explain exactly why, but it was a little bit eerie crossing underneath these wires. These waterbird canoes would become a familiar sight on this trip. I tried to keep my distance from these things, as the crews usually look to be some pretty tough customers. I was passing Bobcat Point, and I felt that evening was starting to set in, and it was time to figure out a campsite. The terrain was pretty rough in this area, and I realized I probably was not going to find level ground to sleep on. I could search further back in the creek, but I didn't want to get too far off course, and there was no guarantee of finding anything level anyways. The first camp involved hauling all the baggage uphill about 100 yards, which was not ideal as I was already exhausted, but I didn't mind it because it turned out to be a really beautiful wooded hilltop, a very nice place to stay the night. I heard somewhere that the Nepalese Gurkhas used to use cut-up bicycle inner tubes as fire starters, and this has now become my absolute favorite fire starter. Concluding day one, I traveled about 7 miles in total, and that's really not bad considering that I ended up sailing much more on the wind than expected at times. More experienced sailors may scoff, but this was by far the greatest distance that I had covered in an engineless boat, and the greatest distance that my little skiff had covered in one go. There's a unique freedom in camping out of a small sailing boat in remote woods, and even more so with a boat that you built with your own hands. I had taken a pile of lumber and fasteners and ended up with a pretty beautiful boat. I think she's beautiful anyways. And there I was, miles down the river, camping on a remote hilltop surrounded by peaceful green woods. With nothing much but a tent and a mattress, it's an experience that relatively few will have in modern times. I was feeling pretty accomplished with 7 miles under the belt on day one, but on day two, the wind would shift dramatically astern, allowing me and my little skiff to rack up the miles like never before on the Cumberland. Join me on the next installment for day 2, with several land explorations, including an unusually tiny island and endless downwind sailing.